These days, a great many of us may be guilty of committing Lashon Hara. Lashon Hara. Lashon Hara could conceivably be the one sin you never knew you were committing when you're committing it. And it is this sin that is the basis of our Torah reading and study for this week. And you know what? After completing my personal study on this reading, I recognized that I had to petition the Father to help me make some changes in my life. I suspect after we complete this study together here today, many of you will find yourself doing the exact same thing. This is foundational truth that will enhance your day-to-day walk with and in Mashiach, in Messiah. Shalom and welcome. And greetings, saints of the Most High. I'm Rod Thomas, and I welcome you to the Messianic Torah Observer. And as always, it is my hope, trust, and prayer that this installment of the Messianic Torah Observer finds you, your families, and fellowships well and blessed. This week, we're returning to Torah. And we're going to study this week's reading under the 3-year Torah reading cycle for the Shabbat dated 11/21 of 2020. And today our reading comes from Numbers chapter 12, verses 1 through 16, and it is entitled Lashon Hara, the sin you never knew you were committing. And that's my title. It's not a rabbinic title that you usually find attached to Torah readings or Torah portions. It's Rod. Just saying. But before we get into today's discussion, may I ask you to please check out our website, which is themessianictorahobserver.org. Again, it's themessianictorahobserver.org. There you'll find everything related to this ministry, including social media platforms we're on, the transcripts for each podcast post, contact information for this ministry, and the means to support this ministry with your financial gifts if you're so led. Which leads me to say that to all of you who have and continue to support this ministry, thank you. Thank you. Your gifts and support help keep us doing what we do, and we greatly appreciate you for what you do in support of this ministry. And with that, let's get into our discussion for today, which I've entitled again, Lashon Hara, the sin you never knew you were committing. This is Torah reading Numbers chapter 12, verses 1 through 16. Now, as we did in our last Torah reading, on finding contentment in our faith, I'm going to read verses of the chapter and then hit some of the interesting elements of each read verse. Please feel free to grab a cup of coffee or tea, your favorite Bible, and let's get into Yah's word today. I'm just trying to find my place in my it's actually my Bible Works program here. I'm bringing it up as we are talking here. There we go. So I'm going to read the verses as we go. Some verses will be just one verse. Others will be a number of verses, but I will read them and then we'll talk about each of those sections as we go along. We could begin at verse 1 today. And I'm going to be reading from the King James Version. And Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. Do you get the sense that they want you to know that Moses had married an Ethiopian woman? They said it twice. Two of Moshe's family members, Miriam and Aaron, engaged in, well, some subversive conversation against Moshe. Moshe apparently married an Ethiopian woman, which seemed to outrage the Miriam and Aaron. Now, depending on the translation you're reading, the woman the two are referencing is labeled as either an Ethiopian or a Cushite, that is, a descendant of Cush. And the billion-dollar question, screaming for an answer regarding this woman, is Zipporah, the wife of Moshe, at least one of his wives, assuming he had another wife, mother of Moshe's son Gershom, the daughter of Jethro, who was the priest of Midian, this so-called Ethiopian or Cushite woman that Miriam and Aaron were so beside themselves over. Were they one and the same person? Torah tells us that Jethro was a Kenite who resided in and served as a priest in the land of Midian. It appears that the Kenites were a nomadic tribe that dwelt primarily in the land of Midian, which supports most Bible students' understanding of Moshe's father-in-law's origins. It should be mentioned also that other names given to Jethro include Reguel and Reuel. Regarding Jethro being a Kenite, as expressed in various English translations of the Bible, including the King James Version and the New English Translation and the New Living Translation, or rather a descendant of Cain, according to the American Standard Version, the Complete Jewish Bible Rendering, and the Holman Christian Study Bible. In order to resolve this mystery of who this Ethiopian or Cushite woman is, well, we must figure out if a Cushite or Ethiopian is also a Kenite or Midianite. It is apparent, despite the absence of the written word to this effect, that Moshe married another woman who happened to be an Ethiopian or Cushite. For it would seem, as far as my research can uncover, Zipporah was not an Ethiopian. The Midianites were actually descended from Abraham, and of course, Moshe was also a descendant of Abraham. Midian was one of Abraham's sons through Keturah, one of Abraham's other wives. And this is all recorded in Genesis chapter 25, verses 1 through 4. Now, we know from Exodus chapter 2, verse 21, that Moshe was given Zipporah as a wife by her father Jethro, and the couple ended up having a son by the name of Gershom. And so that's the skinny on Zipporah and her background. Not much to go on. But we still haven't answered that billion-dollar question that we all are biting at the bit to have answered. Is Zipporah this mystery Ethiopian or Cushite woman that Moshe is supposed to have married and to have ignited a firestorm with Miriam and Aaron? I guess it's possible that Zipporah's mother may have been a Cushite or maybe an Ethiopian, and that's how the writer of Numbers accounts for her Cushite or Ethiopian lineage. But of course, the writer of Numbers, believed of course to be Moshe, didn't mention Zipporah's mother at all in his write-up. So the chances of Zipporah being this mystery Cushite, this Ethiopian woman that Moshe married is, I'd say it's somewhat unlikely. Well, the book of Jasher, and Jasher is one of the apocryphal books of the Tanakh that was once embraced by both Jews and Roman Catholics. Well, Jasher does support the thinking that Moshe had another wife. This is all contained in Jasher chapter 73, verses 30 through 31, which reads accordingly. So Moses took the city by his wisdom, and the children of Cush placed him on the throne instead of Kikianus, king of Cush. And they placed the royal crown upon his, Moshe's head, and they gave him for a wife Adoniah the Cushite queen, wife of Kianas. Now, the problem with this story is at least twofold, at least in my opinion. One, for the most part, the book of Jasher is no longer considered inspired or authoritative by most members of the Judeo-Christian faiths. And thus, with the exception of a small minority of open-minded scriptural enthusiasts within and without our faith, the overwhelming majority of people of faith would not entertain anything the book of Jasher has to say on any subject. 2. The Jasher story puts Moshe marrying this Ethiopian Cushite queen in the land of Cush some 40 years before his meeting and marrying Zipporah in Midian. You see, the book of Jasher details an enormous story around the life of Moshe after his fleeing Mitzrayim, or Egypt, such that he leads the Cushites into a number of battles against their enemies, and the Cushites, in gratitude, make Moshe their king. As king, Moshe is given this Ethiopian or Cushite queen to marry, but apparently Moshe never consummates the marriage. And then 40 years later, Moshe leaves the land of Cush, apparently without his queen wife, and ends up in the land of Midian, where he takes up residence in Jethro's home, ultimately marrying Jethro's daughter Zipporah. A little bit tongue-tied. And of course, none of this is covered in the Torah narrative. Interestingly, Jasher gives only a passing mention of the story that is contained in our reading here today, only mentioning Jehovah's wrath being kindled upon Miriam on account of Moshe. That's a direct quote, resulting in her becoming leprous and her being confined outside of the camp for 7 days. And that's Jasher chapter 83, verses 31 through 32. Absolutely no mention given of this mysterious Ethiopian Cushite wife of Moshe there in the camp in the nation of Israel. And given Jasher's sparse acceptance as a credible historical text, we can only take the book's explanation of who this Ethiopian Cushite wife of Moshe was with prayerful and meditative caution. The last thing I'll say about Jasher and its treatment of the Moshe story is I think we must be cautious when dealing with some of these types of stories, such as Moshe ruling over the Cushite nation for 40 years and so on and so on. I'm not rejecting Jasher as a credible extra-biblical source. I personally believe the book is credible in many respects, as are the books of Jubilees and Enoch. I'm just cautious. I'm cautious when studying them, knowing that men have this tendency to insert themselves into the things of Yah. Yes, I'm talking about altering and manipulating the original text, as they've done with our present canon of Scripture, in order to further an agenda. Moshe being such a giant in Jewish history, like revered leaders throughout the world over the centuries, legends and myths tend to develop around them and their life stories. Those legends and myths are, of course, designed to make these leaders bigger than life. And certainly Moshe was bigger than life in many respects. But his bigness, if you will, his bigness didn't come from his persona or from anything he personally did in his life and in the history of Israel. His bigness came from and because of Jehovah, period. Thus, there was no need to make the man bigger than life, as some of the sages, the Jewish sages, have sought to do in developing their stories about Moshe. Yah must get the glory, not Moshe. Josephus also provides somewhat of an explanation of who this mystery wife of Moshe may be by recording a story that Moshe led an Ethiopian army into some battle where he was victorious over their enemies. And because Moshe proved to be such a great leader to the Ethiopian military, well, the daughter of the king of the Ethiopians became so enamored with Moshe that she married him. And this is all contained in Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, Book 2, Chapter 10, if you're so interested in reading. Granted, Josephus does enjoy a bit more credibility and authority in and around Judeo-Christian circles than the Book of Jasher. But there appears to be mounting evidence here that maybe, just maybe, this mystery woman is in fact Moshe's first or second wife. This woman is not Zipporah. It's another wife. Another perspective on Moshe's Ethiopian or Cushite wife can be found in the Okelos Targums. The Okelos Targums. This translation is a Jewish translation that gives us an insight into the thinking of rabbinic Jews around the 1st, 2nd century, right around the time the Talmud was written. So what they did was that they basically reinterpreted Torah and most of the Tanakh around the way they thought, around the way they perceived these stories to be. So often you'll see the wording is different, or they'll add some nuances to the translation to kind of lead and guide the reader into a direction that they wanted them to understand. Well, in this Targum translation of Numbers chapter 12, verse 1, the Okelos translates the Cushite to mean fair or beautiful, such that this verse reads, "And Miriam and Aaron spake against Moshe because of the fair woman whom he had taken, because the fair woman who had been sent away he had taken." Again, that's the Targum's translation of Numbers chapter 12, verse 1. In this case, there are some Orthodox Jews who contend that Zipporah was indeed beautiful, and that the term Cushite that was used to describe her in this Targum translation was in fact a complimentary description of her. As such, it suggests that Miriam and Aaron took issue to the attractiveness of Moshe's wife. Crazy, huh? And this I have a problem with, as I suspect many of you do. Why would Moshe's family have an issue with Moshe having an attractive wife? It makes absolutely no sense to me. But I guess it's not outside the realm of possibility, presuming there'd be something more than just her looks to cause such dissension within the leadership. Now, the last explanation I came across regarding Moshe's mystery wife comes to us from Orthodox Judaism, which contends that Midian is a synonym of Cushan. These folks, these sages, if you will, these Orthodox Jews cite Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 7 in support of their claim, which reads, "In affliction I saw the tents of Cushan. They trembled, the curtains of the land of Midian." J.H. Hertz, editor and author of Torah and Haftarah, states that Cushan is the home of the North Arabian people called Kusi. So Hertz and others that follow after his line of reasoning contend that this Cushite or Ethiopian woman was indeed the one and only Zipporah. From my perspective, with Jasher, with Josephus, with the Targum, and with the Hertzes aside, I have taken a more conservative view on the identity of Moshe's Ethiopian Cushite wife. I contend that Moshe likely did marry an Ethiopian or Cushite woman who was not the Midianite Zipporah. Clearly, the event that is recorded here in Numbers chapter 12, verse 1 occurred sometime after Moshe married Zipporah. And here's my argument in favor of Moshe having another wife. Given that some time had by now passed since Moshe had married Zipporah in the land of Midian, years before Moshe was sent by Yah to lead the people out of Mitzrayim, out of Egypt, would it make any sense that Miriam and Aaron would criticize Moshe for marrying Zipporah, regardless of her looks? They would have been used to her by now. But why criticize her now? So it would seem more than reasonable to conclude that this Ethiopian, this Cushite woman was another unnamed woman whom Moshe married. Furthermore, is it possible that maybe even Zipporah had died by this time, leaving Moshe a widower and primed to marry again? Assuming Moshe marries after Zipporah dies. Exodus does not record what happened to Zipporah. So I say that we cannot reject Zipporah dying and Moshe remarrying. It's a possibility. And it is this scenario that I lean towards in my understanding of this verse. Of course, if this matters to you, you'll have to decide which scenario makes the most sense to you given the available information. I'm not asking you to buy my explanation of this Cushite, this Ethiopian woman, but I've given you a number of scenarios with the background in the hopes that you will make your own informed decision on the matter. Okay, so having gotten that elephant in the room cleared out, we can now move on to the bigger issues surrounding Moshe and this Cushite wife of his. And that has to do with Miriam's and Aaron's criticism of Moshe over his Ethiopian Cushite wife. And it is here that we learn about the concept of Lashon, Hara, in English, evil speech. We should be able to see a clear connection between the act of Lashon Hara and the act of murmuring. We discussed murmuring quite a bit in our previous post, that being on Numbers chapter 11, verses 1 through 35, or 36 actually. If you read or listened to that post, you will recall that the people murmured against Moshe. In reality, they were murmuring against Jehovah. And they were murmuring because they desired meat to eat. The people were bitterly discontent about their food situation. They're complaining about having just manna to eat. Manna for breakfast, manna for lunch, manna for dinner. I'm getting tired. And these, in their murmuring, longed for their former lives where they ate an abundance of food items, despite them being in bitter Egyptian servitude. And in response to their murmuring, Jehovah's wrath was poured out upon those residing in the outskirts of the camp in the form of a fire that broke out among the people. Upon receiving word that Father's fiery wrath had broken out in the camp among the people, Moshe petitioned Jehovah to have mercy upon the people, which prompted Yah to cease the death and destruction. Furthermore, Jehovah heard the frustrations of Moshe regarding his inability to fulfill the desires of the people for meat, and Jehovah provided the people with quail for a month. So much quail that the people quickly got sick of it. Now, the distinction between Lashon Hara that we see taking place here in our reading today and the murmuring we saw last week's reading is that Lashon Hara leans more towards the act of slander as opposed to bitter complaining, bitter resentment, being ungrateful, which murmuring tends to be. But Lashon Hara is more about slandering the character, the authority, the position of a person. As we see portrayed in our reading, slander, or Lashon Hara, is being directed towards Yah's appointed leader, Moshe. And because Yah appointed Moshe to be leader over the people, Miriam's and Aaron's slander was in effect directed towards Jehovah himself. The bigger issue related to this slander in our focus passage here today is that Moshe's sister and brother were behind it. Miriam and Aaron, for all intents and purposes, by virtue of their close relationship with Moshe and their offices, Miriam, a prophetess, Exodus chapter 15, verse 20, and Aaron, the Levitical high priest, well, they were second and third in command. Not necessarily in that order that I gave you regarding Miriam but they were by all intents and purposes second in command. So it's safe to say that there was dissension within the leadership ranks of the nation. And this dissension was in part over something as petty and foolish as Moshe's wife's heritage, assuming that's the issue. But I doubt it. And we'll find out here shortly that Miriam's and Aaron's issue with Moshe went beyond Moshe's wife and her appearance and her heritage and her lineage and all that. These also took issue with Moshe's relationship with Jehovah, an issue with his appointed and anointed position as the sole leader of the nation. Now, like murmuring, complaining, being ungrateful, well, slander or gossip or Lashon Hara is also a sin. And quite frankly, Lashon Hara or slander is a sin that many within and without our faith community commit on a frequent basis. And here's the tragedy. Most don't even realize that they are in fact sinning when they engage in it. But we'll talk more about this as we progress through the remainder of this discussion. Let's move on to verse 2 of the 12th chapter of Numbers. And it reads, "And they said, Hath Jehovah indeed spoken only by Moses? Hath he not spoken also by us? And Jehovah heard it." So in this verse, Aaron and Miriam question Moshe's authority and leadership, suggesting that Jehovah had also spoken through them to the people. And somehow, the pair connected Moshe's marriage to this Cushite or Ethiopian woman to Moshe's authority as leader over the nation. There's absolutely no way to tell exactly why Miriam and Aaron tied Moshe's Cushite Ethiopian wife to Moshe's leadership and authority over the nation. And in my understanding of the story, it doesn't seem too much of a stretch to recognize the real issue at work here. Miriam and Aaron felt because they were Moshe's siblings, they were authoritatively equal to Moshe. It's likely that they were not content with their privileged status in the nation. They desired or they coveted more power and authority than they presently possessed. They desired to share control over the nation, and I believe they were having a difficult time coming to terms with the close and unshakable relationship Jehovah had with Moshe. The problem here is that Aaron and Miriam did not understand how Jehovah works, nor did they believe Jehovah. What do I mean by these 2 points? 1, they did not recognize that Jehovah was the one running the show, and that it was Jehovah who called the shots in terms of who would lead the nation. Neither they nor anyone else called the shots here. The buck stopped at Yehovah. Family affiliations mattered in this situation only to the extent that Miriam and Aaron had rank and privilege within the nation. Aaron was, as I mentioned earlier, the appointed high priest, and Miriam was an anointed prophetess. Yah is always sovereign, and he can appoint whomever he chooses to lead his people. And he chose Moshe. Number 2, they did not believe Yehovah when he stated and demonstrated to the nation on many occasions that Moshe was his man to lead the nation. In particular, I would refer you to Exodus chapter 19, verse 20. And as we progress further along in our study here this evening, we're going to see even more evidence that Moshe was Yah's man of the hour. There would be no other. Moving on to verse 3 of the 12th chapter of Numbers. And it reads, Now the man Moshe was very meek, above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. In this verse, all indications are that this was added by Hebrew scribes at some point in the history, or in Israel's history, I should say, as is evidenced by the brackets around the whole verse. Most English translations, with the exception of a few, have brackets around the words of that entire chapter, which is indicative of a probable addition. Some scribe added it, some commentator added it at some point. But the manuscripts that we have now all have this as part of the original text. But this is the problem. This is some of the things that we have to always be aware of when we're reading. Nevertheless, this verse serves as an editorial on the person of Moshe, that Moshe was the humblest person on this planet. And it's hard to imagine Moshe wrote this of himself. That's one of the reasons why, apart from the brackets. But the brackets, they don't have brackets in Hebrew. But the other thing is just the wording. It's highly unlikely that Moshe, if he was humble, would write this about himself. And of course, the other person to whom this level of humility could be applied to is Yehoshua HaMashiach, Yeshua Messiah. Matthew chapter 11, verse 29. Master said, Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. Hallelujah. There is indeed some scholarly debate as to whether or not Moshe actually wrote this verse, but it could be safely determined that Moshe was aware of Miriam's and Aaron's bad mouthing of him. Yet Moshe took no action to halt their slandering or evil speech against him. But in that same vein, it is a certainty that Yehovah was fully aware of Miriam's and Aaron's slanderous conversations. Moving on, this time we're going to read verses 4 and 5. And Yehovah spake suddenly unto Moshe and unto Aaron and unto Miriam, Come out, ye three, unto the tabernacle of the congregation. And they three came out. Verse 5. And Jehovah came down in the pillar of the cloud and stood in the door of the tabernacle and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forth. In these verses, we find that suddenly Yehovah calls Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam out to the front of the tabernacle. Hebraist and Messianic Torah teacher Tim Haig describes what happened here in a most profound way. He wrote, In the secret rooms of slander, God's ear is attentive. Haig also adds something quite interesting to the discussion here that I'd not given much thought of or to prior to reading his commentary on this passage. And what he proposes is that Jehovah was responding to Miriam's slander and to Aaron's entertaining of Miriam's slander. For there's no indication that Aaron actually verbalized his thoughts during his subversive conversation with Miriam. And I would have to agree with Mr. Haig on this nuance, as it seems to bear some weight on how Yah will mete out punishment for their actions later on in this story. But as the story goes, Yah descends down from heaven in the form of a pillar of cloud, and he stands before the entrance to the tabernacle. Yah then summons Aaron and Miriam to step forward towards him. And both, no doubt, being extremely terrified of the prospects facing them, they do as they are commanded. Verses 6 through 8 this time. And it reads, "And he said," this is Yahweh, or Jehovah speaking, Jehovah, Yahweh, Yahuwah, however you declare his name. "And he said, Hear now my words. If there be a prophet among you, I, Jehovah, will make myself known unto him in a vision, and will speak unto him in a dream." Verse 7. "My servant Moshe is not so, who is faithful in all mine house." In verse 8, "With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly, and not in riddles. And he beholds the form of Jehovah. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moshe?" Good question. So Father proceeds here to inform Aaron and Miriam that Moshe is unique in his calling. In pointing out why Moshe is unique in his calling, Father distinguishes Moshe from, on the one hand, a prophet who Jehovah reveals himself to primarily in visions, in dreams, even parables from time to time. On the other hand, according to Jehovah, he speaks to Moshe directly, mouth to mouth, clearly, not in riddle. And Moshe also physically sees a manifestation of the Almighty during his interactions with Jehovah. In fact, Moshe was privy to direct one-on-one conversations with the Almighty, unlike prophets who would receive communications from Yah via dreams or visions. So in the case of prophets, there is generally no two-way conversation or communication. In Moshe's case, he's certainly fully conscious and fully engaged in conversation with Jehovah. Father considered Moshe alone as trustworthy in all Jehovah's household. In other words, Moshe was found worthy of the Creator's confidence in everything pertaining to his leadership of the nation of Israel. So with all this said, Father asked the pair the simple question: knowing the difference in how Yah works and interacts and communicates with Moshe and other servants of Jehovah, such as prophets, why in the world would you think to speak evil against your brother Moshe? What Father is saying to Miriam and Aaron here, and by extension us here today, is that the instructions and commandments that come to the nation from Moshe is the prototype. It's the test by which all other revelations of Jehovah is to be judged. In fact, whatever comes out of Moshe's mouth can be taken as coming directly from Jehovah. Unlike prophets that receive revelation from Yah in a vision or dream, and their messages are to be scrutinized accordingly, the revelation that Moshe passes on to the nation is not to be questioned, nor scrutinized. It's fiat. It's unquestionable. This is the foundation of our faith. Torah, the word of Yah, which was delivered to us by Moshe, and it is to stand without question. And those who choose to question Moshe's authority stand to be judged without mercy. How many people have taken the dangerous position of teaching and preaching a message that Moshe and Torah no longer have any authority in the life of Yah's people? And one of the references I can point you to is Hebrews chapter 10, verse 28. Are these, in a sense, like Miriam and Aaron? I'm talking about the naysayers, those who like to say that the law is done away with, leading tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, down the road toward destruction. Are these subject to some form of punishment to be meted out by the Almighty? I would say, yeah, probably. Let's continue on. Verses 9 and 10. And the anger of Jehovah was kindled against them, and he departed. Verse 10. When the cloud departed from off the tabernacle, and behold, Miriam became leprous, white as snow. And Aaron looked upon Miriam, and behold, she was leprous. In this passage, after delivering this sobering edict to Miriam and Aaron, well, the record shows that Yah angrily departed their presence. And at this point in this story, my imagination is drawn to those movies where something terrible is about to happen to the stars, but the perpetrator of that terrible thing is not visible to the viewers at that time. So ominous music and terrifying music is usually playing in the background, giving you the sense of tense anticipation of what is about to happen, anticipation of the shoe dropping any moment and someone's going to end up dead. Well, I can imagine that Miriam and Aaron may have been literally peeing on themselves in utter terror of what was about to happen. You know, that oh snap moment that you see often in various places and times of life. It's like, oh, yikes. But once Jehovah's presence had left the scene, Aaron turns to Miriam, no doubt in complete terror of what is going to happen to them, and he sees his sister leprous. Now, the text described Miriam's body as appearing white as snow. And no doubt the extent of her leprosy communicated to anyone in eyesight of her a death sentence. Conversely, Miriam would have been utterly mortified over her appearance. And no doubt Aaron was confused as to why he had not been stricken with the leprosy as well. No doubt Moshe, who was close by, was filled with a variety of thoughts and emotions. And I would imagine that Moshe thought his sister was a dead woman walking. It's possible Moshe felt responsible for what had happened to his sister. There's just so much to imagine here as it relates to the possible emotions and thoughts of these three. Generally, leprosy itself would not cause immediate direct death. Leprosy was one of those opportunistic diseases that in many cases lead to a complete breakdown of the body after a prolonged period of painful sores and nerve damage over the victim's entire body. And you can check all of this out online. It's all out there. I mean, I'm not saying this because I know it. I looked into it. I've also done some research in the past on leprosy, and it's pretty well documented on the internet. You can check many places. But probably the most bitter part of leprosy was that because leprosy is relatively contagious, and if leprosy is not checked and the person quarantined, it could decimate an entire community of people. So victims of this disease in ancient times were ejected from and abandoned by their communities so as to not cause the spread of the disease. Don't we kind of see something like that today with the COVID? Not to get off course, here, but certainly Miriam would be facing all of what we just mentioned unless she would be delivered through some miraculous intervention by the Almighty. There was no cure for leprosy, period. There was no cure for leprosy. Only through Yah can one escape the plague of leprosy. Even to this day, there's really no cure. But in order for that to happen, Moshe would be required to intercede on her behalf. Let's go on to verse 11 and 12 of the 12th chapter of Numbers. And it reads, "And Aaron said unto Moses, Alas, my Lord, my master, I beseech you, I beseech thee, lay not the sin upon us, wherein we have done foolishly, and wherein we have sinned." Verse 12. "Let her not be as one dead," death sentence, "of whom the flesh is half consumed when he cometh out of his mother's womb." So here Aaron turns to Moshe, and he pleads for the life of his sister in what we could say is a strange twist of fortune. For it was just shortly before this that the trio was called out to the tabernacle, and Miriam and Aaron were engaged in the sin of Lashon Hara, or slander or evil speech against Moshe. And that Lashon Hara, or subversion, or evil speak, or slander against Yah and his man, well, it consisted of challenges to Moshe's authority and personal relationship with the creator of the universe. And what Yah has set up here in sight of not just the trio, that being Aaron, Miriam, and Moshe, but even those of the nation who may have been nearby, well, is a full endorsement of Moshe's leadership and an endorsement of and a certification of all that Father had said to Miriam and Aaron. For this incident would serve as a terrible example and reminder for the people that when you seek to undermine Yah and undermine the authority that he has given to his servants, in particular here Moshe, well, you transgress Yah's word, and you are subject to the penalty and condemnation of Torah, which is usually death. And this is what Miriam was facing here at this juncture of our story. Now, one of the big points to be gleaned here is that Aaron, in his pleading with Moshe to intercede on behalf of their sister, well, he brilliantly demonstrated Aaron's total and complete submission to Moshe's God-given authority over not just the nation, but over him, the high priest of the nation. Moshe he submitted to Moshe's God-given authority over him as well. That is key. That is key. Let's move on to verse 13. And it reads, "And Moshe cried unto Jehovah, saying, Heal her now, O Elohim, O God, I beseech thee." And of course, true to Moshe's humble and caring nature, Moshe cries out to Jehovah, "Oh God, please heal her, please." In the English Standard Version rendering, it just a heart-wrenching plea to save the life of his sister. And surely Moshe could have shied away from petitioning Yah for the healing of his sister, but he could not bear to see his sister suffer 1 second longer, despite what she'd done in an attempt to undermine his authority through her committing Lashon Hara. So with much agony, Moshe pleaded with the Almighty to heal Miriam, as evidenced by the double use of the word please in the one verse. Obviously, Moshe had forgiven Miriam and Aaron, as evidenced in his petitioning Yah for Miriam's healing, and in response to Aaron's plead. Clearly, Moshe demonstrated for us all proper kingdom behavior. In fact, Moshe imaged Yeshua-focused Torah living, and he did so some 1,500 or more years before Yeshua taught the following, found in Luke chapter 6, verses 28 through 31. Bless them that curse you. Pray for them which despitefully use you. And unto him that smiteth thee on the one cheek, offer also the other. And him that taketh away thy cloak, forbid not to take thy coat also. Give to every man that asketh of thee. And of him that taketh away thy goods, ask them not again. And as ye would that men should do to you, do ye also to them likewise. Again, that was Luke chapter 6, verses 28 through 31. Let's move on to the final 3 verses of our chapter, verses 14 through 16. And it reads, And Jehovah said unto Moshe, If her father had but spit in her face, should she not be ashamed 7 days? Let her be shut out from the camp 7 days, and after that let her be received in again. Verse 15. And Miriam was shut out from the camp 7 days, and the people journeyed not till Miriam was brought in again. And lastly, verse 16. And afterward the people removed from Hazareth and pitched in the wilderness of Paran. So here in these 3 verses, in response to Moshe's desperate petition, Jehovah responds with something akin to Miriam needing to be taught a lesson. And interestingly, Yah uses the example in comparison of a parent who sets out to shame his and her daughter for something she did to transgress her family, whereby the parent puts the daughter into a 7-day timeout as a rebuke. So Miriam's crime, or let's say sin, is significantly more serious than, let's say, a daughter disrespecting her parents. Miriam's sin was subversive in nature. And because of the severity of this sin, Miriam most certainly could have been subject to death. So Jehovah extended grace towards Miriam. And thus Miriam's punishment for her Lashon Hara was spending a miserable 7 days in shame outside the camp. Now, some may see this punishment as being a bit too harsh, but the truth of the matter is that Miriam deserved death in exchange for her evil speech against Yah and Yah's man of the hour. Indeed, the wages of sin is always going to be death, but the gift of Jehovah is life eternal through Yeshua Messiah. Romans chapter 6, verse 23. You see, we live today under the law of grace. We have grace extended to us, and thus we are not subject to the condemnation of Torah. However, just because we are saved from eternal death as a result of Yah's grace extended down to us through the workings of Yeshua Messiah, when we sin, when we offend Yah, when we transgress his Torah, we, like Miriam, may be subject to some form of punishment. Scripture is clear that we reap what we sow. And reaping what we sow is not just about reaping blessings because of the good things we do, but also reaping punishments for the sins that we commit. And I would refer you to Job chapter 4, verse 8. And here's the spiritual dilemma that a great many of us find ourselves facing from time to time. We commit sins, some of those sins unwittingly, unknowingly, and as a result, we receive punishment for those sins. Ignorance of Torah does not insulate us from punishment. Father was clear. Your sin will find you out. Numbers 32, verse 20. Aaron, in pleading for the life of his sister, said to Moshe that what he and Miriam were doing in their conversation was a foolish act. And it was because of the severity of Miriam's punishment that Aaron recognized that his and Miriam's foolish actions was actually sinning. Verse 11. In their bad-mouthing and slandering of their brother Moshe, well, Miriam and Aaron were sinning. And they had no clue they were sinning. Folks, let this Torah reading serve as a lesson to us all that the unwitting sins we commit subject us to punishment. And it behooves us to seek Yeshua Messiah's intercession to petition Father's forgiveness for the foolish things we do that are in reality sinful acts. In my prayers, I make it a point to always ask Father to forgive me for the things I've done to offend him and transgress his Torah, and to reveal those sinful things that I've done unknowingly to me so that I may not repeat them in the future. And this reading proved to be a revelation to me, for I've been known from time to time to engage in critical conversations about people in leadership positions. And there's nothing wrong about disagreeing with another person's position on certain things. It's not sinful to articulate one's disagreement of another's position on an issue. However, there's always a however. It is sinful when we cast judgments, when we cast slanders, and we cast other hateful and evil speech towards those we disagree with. Why? Because such speech serves only to diminish the object of our slanders in the eyes of others. And boy, do we see a lot of this being played out today in the political landscape. Not just by so-called journalists and political pundits, but more so by everyday people like you and me. Terrible and slanderous things are being uttered and written by folks from all walks of life against those who are in leadership positions over us, as well as against one another. It's just terrible, the things that are going on around us today. And the slandering, the Lashon Hara that is being done in such a flippant and disregard manner. And many of these folks that are doing this are Yah's people. When it comes to leadership, Yah put folks in the positions they're in. And he does that regardless whether or not we believe it. Regarding this very thing about putting people in position, Yah putting people in the positions of leadership that they're in, well, Titus chapter 3, verse 1, Paul wrote, "Put them in mind to be subject to principalities and powers, to obey magistrates, to be ready to every good work." And then he wrote to the Roman Messianics in chapter 13, verse 1, "Let every soul be in subjection to the higher powers. For there is no power but Yah, and the powers that be are tongue-tied again, and the powers that be are ordained of Yah." How about that? The Apostle Peter also wrote in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 15, "Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the master's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or unto governors as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of Yah, that with well-doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men." Let's get back to our verse as we start to wrap this thing up. So Miriam was confined or quarantined to the outside of the camp in accordance with Torah, Leviticus chapter 13, verse 46. And again, as a result of Yah's grace, Yah held off moving the camp from their present location until the end of the 7 days when Miriam was permitted back into the camp. You see, Yah's grace must never be overlooked or marginalized in Torah. Oh my goodness. And people will say there's no grace in Torah. Yah's grace is all over the place. The passage doesn't address it directly, but we can safely presume that Miriam was fully restored to her former health and vitality. Hallelujah. Given that the Levitical quarantine for leprosy was 14 days and Miriam was quarantined for only 7, supports the assumption that Miriam was fully healed. And the camp then moved out from Hazareth onto the wilderness of Paran. So, the logical question to be asked here is, why didn't Aaron receive the same or equal punishment to that of Miriam? Wasn't this the second biggest screw-up of Aaron's, where he escaped punishment, the first being the golden calf incident, where he was the one that fashioned the golden calf or the idols for the people to worship at the base of the mountain, a base of God's mountain, Yah's mountain, setting up an idol in Yah's face, in front of his place, and yet he got, I'm getting off course. Yah's his grace is just so amazing sometimes. Well, Tim Hague suggests that Aaron was not the one who committed the slander, but was simply the one listening and possibly agreeing to Miriam's slander of Moshe. Thus, Aaron's role in the Lashon Hara, or the slander, was one of being guilty by association, or as one who invited the slander to take place in his, or let's say her, presence. Aaron, in his begging Moshe for the life of his sister, stated that he in Miriam's slanderous actions was foolish, absent malice or ill intent. But as Hague points out, Lashon Hara is not judged on the basis of the ill intentions of the offenders. Lashon Hara is sin, and it must be dealt with one way or another. There can be no emotion attached to the sin problem. It must be dealt with in accordance to the ways Yah has it set up to be dealt with. Now, I don't necessarily agree nor disagree with Mr. Hague's position on Aaron. All we know for certain is Yah is always playing 4D chess, so to speak, whenever he is dealing with his human creation. And Yah knew exactly what he was doing and what the outcome would be as a result of his response to the slandering of Miriam and Aaron's participation. As it relates to us today, all sin, including the sin of slander, requires the work of an intercessor to address that sin issue. Like we saw brilliantly demonstrated in our Torah reading here today, Miriam and Aaron desperately needed an intercessor. Otherwise, Miriam would die a lonely, miserable death outside the nation. And their intercessor turned out to be the very one who they slandered, Moshe. Of course, for us today, our intercessor is none other than Master Yahushua HaMashiach, Yeshua Messiah. And in a great sense, we can safely say from our reading here today that Moshe served as a type of Mashiach, a type of Messiah, since he effectively rendered unto Miriam intercession unto Yah to commute her death sentence. Like Miriam, we receive forgiveness of our sins when we seek Yah's forgiveness through the intercessory work of Master Yeshua, and upon forgiveness, we are graciously accepted back into the royal priesthood. Whether we realize it or not, we all are guilty of some form of Lashon Hara throughout our lives. And the simple fact of the matter is that many of us are committing the act of Lashon Hara at various and sundry times, some multiple times throughout the day, and we don't even realize it. And we must be on guard of this pervasive sin that has the potential of spiritually grounding each of us if we don't take needed spiritual precautions. Well, I know some of you may disagree with my position on such things as bad mouthing or slandering politicians is a sin, citing that politicians or public officials do not fall within the category of God's people, and so forth and so forth. And that is definitely true, that politicians generally don't fall within the category of Jehovah's elect. But again, we must remember that Jehovah places into positions of power those who he chooses to fulfill his will in the earth. So for us to slander any person in leadership, whether they be within or without our faith community, yes, I'm also talking about the leaders in our faith community, for whatever reason, doing so is tantamount to committing the very sin that Miriam was punished for. So we have to be very careful when engaging in dialogue against individuals in leadership positions, regardless who they may be. It's better to exercise godly wisdom and control over our tongues whenever we speak. For Master himself certified that every idle word that men shall speak, they shall give account thereof in the day of judgment. Matthew chapter 12, verse 36. Folks, this is exactly why we need to diligently study Torah and the teachings and example of Master Yehoshua HaMashiach, Yeshua Messiah. Ignorance of such things as Lashon Hara may lead to consequences in our lives. That's why when we pray, it is important that we ask Yah to reveal to us those areas, those habits, those unwitting, unknowing sins that we commit in our lives that offend him and transgress his Torah. And the great thing about Yeshua-focused Torah living is that we have in Torah and in the teachings of Yeshua an ensample unto us such that we may not live ungodly lives, according to 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 6. And the other thing we have to be conscious of is our motives. Our motives, especially when engaging in potentially controversial discussions about other people. Do we possess a right heart about the matter in question? Or do we seek to diminish the target of our slander before the eyes and minds of others? These are what I call checkpoint questions that we must ask ourselves before engaging in certain conversations. You know, I often I get my news from various online news sites each day, and at times I find myself vehemently disagreeing with something that perhaps someone says regarding an issue, whether in the article or in the comment section. Well, at the bottom of most of these online articles, the sites provide the means for leaving comments. And in those times when I am compelled to respond to an issue that may be somewhat controversial, that I take exception to, I have come to learn that I must always check my intentions before entering a comment. You know, I've found that at times my frustrations and my anger and my ire over the things that the article may have addressed that have maybe offended me or that defy Torah and the teachings of Yeshua, well, it's motivating me. That article is motivating me to respond in a potentially slanderous way. And if I recognize that my heart ain't right during those times, well, I back away and write, and I don't write anything, and I move on to the next article or whatever. I let it go. I'm learning to let things go like that. It's not worth committing a sin. It's not worth damaging my relationship with the Almighty. It's not worth hindering my walk with Messiah. That is the mind we must have, wisdom and a right heart. We should know ourselves, and we should know the state of our hearts at all times. And in order to do that, we have the help of the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, to convict us of our ill intentions and darkened hearts. 1 John chapter 3, verse 20. Friends, Yah is on our side. And he certainly does not want us to fall into sin, especially the sin of Lashon Hara, and risk incurring his wrath. Yah wants to see us succeed. We just have to play the game of life according to his rules and open ourselves to self-examination at all times. We have the victory over sin in our lives already in our grasp. We simply have to walk in that victory. I pray you got something out of this study today. If you have any questions or comments of an edifying nature, please feel free to leave them in the comment boxes below this post on our website, the Messianic Torah Observer. And until next time, my dear, blessed saints, friends, brethren, may you be most blessed, fellow saints in training. Shalom and blessings to you all.